Buenas tardes a todos.
Good evening, everyone.
Y bienvenidos a Casa Árabe.
Welcome to Casa Árabe.
Dedicar a las turbulencias.
We're going to be talking about the turbulence in Gulf politics. I would first and foremost like to thank all of you for coming. When the Casa Árabe team started to consider organizing a debate on this subject, we all agreed that it was the right time to do so. If we didn't do so now, when would we consider it relevant? But it was also a bit scary taking into account the time of the year, holidays, the heat, that maybe nobody showed up. So we are tremendously happy to see you all here, because that encourages us at Casa Árabe to continue with our work. And when I was thinking what I should say in my brief introduction of our two speakers, I was recalling the beginning of a work by Kant, The Enlightenment, where we're using, he said, sapere audere, you have to dare to know in others that you have to dare to know for yourself. That, I think, therefore I think it's most timely to remember that today, and the two lectures we're going to be listening to today. And to sum up, the spirit and the will of Casa Árabe, which is to offer information and knowledge that enables anyone interested in these matters to reach their own opinions, conclusions, and criteria. The two speakers are going to offer us precisely that base, so that each one of you can go a bit beyond the mere headlines of newspapers and the news on television to understand this very difficult to understand crisis between Qatar and the other Gulf cooperation countries. As this isn't about me and me talking more, you've come here to listen to our two guest speakers. So I will end with a brief introduction of each of them. First of all, we will be talking about Tony Matthiesen, who is Senior Research Fellow in the International Relations Center of the Middle East at St. Anthony's College at Oxford University. He was previously a Research Fellow at Pembroke College, Cambridge, and also at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he gained his doctorate from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS. He's the author of Sectarian Gulf, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, the Arab Spring that wasn't, the other Saudis, Shiism, dissent, and sectarianism. Mr. Matthiesen has also published widely in various academic journals and in the mainstream media, and has appeared on major TV and radio networks. His current research focuses on the Sunni-Shia divide and the legacies of the Cold War in the Middle East. Afterwards, Luciano Zaccara will be taking the floor, Assistant Professor, Center for Gulf Studies, Qatar University. Previously, he was visiting Assistant Professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar, where he taught democratization processes in the Middle East and Iranian politics. He has worked since 2002 as a researcher at the Lab for Mediterranean International Studies, Arab and Islamic Studies at the Autonomous University, and also as a teacher in the doctorate in Mediterranean International Affairs and the master's degree in Arab and Islamic Studies. He got his degree at El Rosario in University in Argentina and his PhD from the Autónoma University in Madrid. So without further ado, I will first give the floor to Toby Matthiesen, thanking him once again for his presence, and Luciano Zaccara as well. And we hope that their stay with us here at Casa Árabe may be very fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this invitation and for the opportunity to speak here. I will try to explain, together with my colleague Luciano, the current crisis, but mainly through a historical lens. Because on the face of it, the recent diplomatic crisis in the Gulf in the last few weeks doesn't make very much sense to outsiders as well as to experts. On the face of it, these are monarchies, hereditary monarchies, neighbors. Broadly speaking, they have a similar kind of political economy, they have similar political systems, and until a month ago, they've been major allies, all members in the Gulf Cooperation Council, which they founded together and which in which they wanted to establish a common foreign policy. So on the face of it, it doesn't make very much sense, and it is very much like one member state of the European Union turning on, or a group of member states turning on another. And while we've seen problems in the European Union in the last, year and even before, this is kind of beyond a comparison, and the situation is now really quite tense and bad in the Gulf. So I think this all, while it is quite difficult to explain in general because it relates to a lot of different subjects, and I will just name them now at the start of the talk. I think on the one hand, we have to think about the relationships between a very small state and regional hegemons, so big states in the region. On the other hand, this is all related to the history of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the Gulf more broadly, but also to the developments within political Islam as well as Arab nationalism. And the American kind of led agenda in the region in the last couple of decades. So it is really quite difficult to explain why this crisis has erupted at the moment, but let's try anyway. So the Gulf states have all kind of emerged out of a history of either having alliances with the Ottoman Empire or with the British Empire. There were treaty relationships between the different ruling families in the region, which basically ensured that the ruling families, which in the 18th and 19th century often only controlled really small port towns, then were able to transfer their political rule into the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century and the 21st century, and emerge as independent states. So it was from early times a relationship with imperial powers and global powers that ensured that these monarchies were able to survive. The region we're talking about is unique in global comparison because such monarchies have survived not only in nominal form as perhaps in this country, but the monarchs actually rule, and that in part is because of this relationship to global powers. And after the British Empire left the Gulf militarily, they were quickly replaced by the United States. This was at the time of the Cold War, and most of these states, and particularly Saudi Arabia, became a crucial ally of the United States throughout the whole of the Cold War. And today we're facing a situation where all of the states involved, except Egypt, host major US military bases or major American presences. Therefore, it is a bit of an anomaly in global comparison, right? That one major U.S. ally would threaten its neighbor to such an extent. In 1981, these states of the Gulf monarchies, decided to establish the Gulf Cooperation Council, mainly as a result of the Iranian Revolution, the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran on the other side of the Gulf region, which they saw as a threat to themselves, partly because the Islamic Republic wanted to be a pan-Islamic revolution that should apply to, should be a model for all Muslims, but also because it was then kind of specifically popular amongst some of the Shia populations in the smaller Gulf states, such as in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. So shortly after the revolution, this council was established, and it has been kind of plagued by serious problems ever since. And I suppose one of the main tensions has been from the start the fact that one country is much larger than all the other members in this council, and that country is Saudi Arabia. So from the beginning, there's always been a bit of a balancing, if you want to put it in a positive term, or, tension, if you want to use a more negative term, between Saudi Arabia and the other member states of the GCC. Now, in the face of this Iranian, very tense relationships with Iran in the 1980s, this, was not so much of an issue yet. But then when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the Gulf Cooperation Council actually experienced its first and so far only very serious military test, in the sense that one of its members was invaded by a hostile country. And whatever efforts were made in the 1980s to try to establish a common military structure failed in that instance, right? The Americans and other countries needed to come to liberate Kuwait from Saudi Arabia. So at that point, America still had a massive military base in Saudi Arabia, through which this liberation of Kuwait was organized, and as a result of a mass deployment of up to 500,000 American soldiers to Saudi Arabia, a kind of protest movement and an opposition movement emerged in Saudi Arabia that galvanized, broadly speaking, Islamic movements that were criticizing the royal family for their close alliance with the United States, and were criticizing this massive military presence in Saudi Arabia. So an effect of that has eventually been that this military base was closed, fully closed in the 2000s, and largely moved to Qatar. So perhaps something that from nowadays perspective the Saudis regret. But this turned Qatar, which in 1995 had seen a regime change, a coup by the current emir's father against the then present emir, which suddenly saw Qatar play a much more important role geostrategically. Suddenly, the place for the most important American military base in the Gulf and probably in the wider region, and in fact the military base from which much of the Iraq War and some of the war in Afghanistan were organized. So suddenly Qatar becomes a crucial cornerstone of the global American security architecture. And at the same time, Qatar, under the father of the current emir, starts to become an active player on the global stage, tries to, through different means, diplomacy, but also in particular soft power, tries to push its brand image across the world with sponsorship deals, for example, here. You might be interested to know that citizens of the countries participating in the blockade are not allowed to wear Barcelona football shirts anymore, amongst other such things, but really started to get buy itself into a lot of the European, American, as well as Australian and other kind of publics And that was, in fact, a strategy that Qatar shared with particularly the United Arab Emirates, who's done very similar things around the world, and some smaller states as well, Kuwait, and to a certain extent the Saudis as well. And I suppose for people, who are not in the region, these Gulf states were all kind of seen as similar. I mean, they all broadly also had they wanted somehow similar things. They wanted to be visible on a global stage, and they wanted to be taken seriously as important partners in the region, and at times also set a common agenda, such as on Syria. But so the 1990s and in the 2000s are really the period when Qatar emerges kind of in the region as a power broker and globally. So you, of course, know all the story of Al Jazeera. I won't go much into that, but Al Jazeera is also now, in the current crisis, a crucial bone of contention. But we shouldn't forget that in the past 20 years, it has really revolutionized the way Arab media functions, the way Arab publics think about politics and debate politics. That was very much, before the emergence of social media, Al Jazeera was really hugely important, perhaps more important than it is now. But so associated with Al Jazeera, there was the establishment of a whole number of think tanks, universities, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure Luciano will talk a little bit about that. But these kind of developments in the 2000s, broadly speaking, put Qatar on a collision course with its neighbors as soon as the Arab uprisings unfolded, because of its long-standing alliances with different political movements, which in fact often also had a problem with each other. Qatar never had just one foreign policy or supported only one particular ideological trend. One of the things it did was just talk to a lot of different sides and host a lot of different sides in various conflicts, and often in cooperation with the United States. For example, now it is accused of hosting the Taliban leadership. Well, that was something that was in agreement with the United States, and many of the other kind of later mediation efforts that Qatar has done as well. But so basically, it supported, and that's the aspect of the story that a lot of people know. It supported, broadly speaking, the Muslim Brotherhood trends in the region. But at the same time, it invited some of the most prominent Arab nationalist intellectuals to set up big think tanks in Doha, and also people from other ideological persuasions. And that is, in fact, complicated by a further factor. I don't want to confuse you too much, but I think it's something that hasn't been mentioned very much, is that officially Qatar is actually a Wahhabi state, which means that it traces its official religious establishment kind of traces its origins and ideological origins back to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of what was later called the Wahhabi movement in 18th century, the Arabian Peninsula, which is the kind of bedrock of the religious ideology in Saudi Arabia. So it's the only other state apart from Saudi Arabia that shares this ideology or interpretation of Islam, and it also institutes it in its courts to a certain extent. So there is a little bit of a rivalry also about the legacy of the Wahhabi movement, which is, we're never talking about that in the media. But broadly speaking, Qatar supported various brands of political Islam, in particular the Muslim Brotherhood. And at the start of the Arab uprisings, its media and it's different think tanks and so on and so forth just embraced in general the whole protest movements across the region. And while not very outspokenly, also to a certain extent was not as negative in its coverage of the uprising in Bahrain, which is the neighboring smaller Gulf state and the Gulf state that saw the biggest impact of the Arab uprisings, and in 2011 saw a mass uprising. That again has been taken up now as one way of criticizing Qatar by these four states. So it's really in a lot of the different arenas that the Arab uprisings kind of opened up for conflict, that Qatar started to have a different view of how things should play out from its neighbors, in particular the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And so the most prominent, which has been again discussed in the media quite a lot, is Egypt, where Qatar strongly supported first the protest movement and then the government of Mohamed Morsi, and in fact also with very strong financial backing tried to support his government. And after the change of regime was declared, state non grata, if such a thing exists in international relations. And therefore we see Egypt now being part of these four countries. But this is obviously an Egypt that has gone through successive waves of regime change and is quite different from the one from 2011 to 2013. Another connected area of rivalry is Libya, where again the UAE in particular and Qatar have since 2011 backed different forces, and that is connected to Egypt because General Haftar, who's now being built up as the kind of secular strongman backed by the UAE, is also close to the Sisi regime in Egypt, and it is through Egypt that a lot of the support for him in Libya kind of works. Another key contention is Palestine, Gaza, Qatar's support for the reconstruction of Gaza and for Hamas as a political movement. There has been some movement there in the recent weeks where initially the stopping support for Hamas was one of the conditions of the four states. Now that's been dropped again. It's unclear what's going on there. So having talked about the reasons why we now have such a disagreement, I mean, it would have also been quite easy before this crisis to give a talk about all the things these states have in common, and they actually want to see happening in a similar way in the region. I mean, the Syrian war was the dominant kind of issue in the Middle East, to some extent still is, and there, broadly speaking, all of these Gulf states were on the same page in terms of they wanted the Assad as a president gone, and the Assad regime, broadly speaking, dismantled. Qatar and Saudi Arabia had rivalries in Syria about which faction to back. At times these were quite serious disagreements. But it is kind of, it is wrong to say that Saudi Arabia only backed secular, rebels in Syria, and the Qataris are the only ones who backed whatever, Islamists or jihadis who had a negative view of Alawites or Christians or some such thing. Both and many other countries did the same. And but in Syria, again, all of these countries have, broadly speaking, lost, since the Syrian civil war is, in broad terms, has been decided so far, at least, in favor of the Assad regime and its international backers. So perhaps it is because Syria has been sidelined a bit that now this recent crisis has emerged much more strongly. And I would just like to reiterate that I started the talk with mentioning quite a lot the American involvement and the fact that they're all American allies and the military bases and so on and so forth. I mean, it is not a coincidence that this recent issue arose after Trump's visit to Riyadh. Now, I also can't really explain to myself, and I think we tried to figure out that before, why exactly this happened now. It has something to do with the new crown prince in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, with an effort at portraying strength for domestic audiences in Saudi Arabia, the UAE and in Egypt, and to a certain extent also Bahrain, which is also nominally a part of this anti-Qatar alliance. But Trump's visit must have been the catalyst for this escalation. But in some ways, it is self-defeating, because Trump went to Riyadh for a big summit of heads of state of Islamic countries. And except perhaps 2 or 3, almost all heads of state of Muslim majority countries attended that meeting in Riyadh, and they all agreed that there's one big evil country in the region, and that is Iran, and we should all have an alliance together against Iran. And Trump even started talking about there's one state that really sponsors terrorism in the world, and you know who I mean. And then the room was quiet; nobody really knew. I mean, some people might have known, and he said Iran. And now, 1 month later, we have a situation where suddenly Qatar is the only big sponsor of terrorism in the world. So, I mean, I'm afraid I'm ending this talk on a less serious note than I started. I'm also at a bit of a loss, but I've just tried to present you some of the underlying causes for some of the tensions between the states, between the rulers and their people, and the different ideologies that are around in that region. Thank you.
Bueno, como Toby dijo que está
Very well. As Toby said, he was a bit lost. I will tell you that I am as well, and I really don't know why this is happening, or what is worse, how to get out of the situation, as we were talking before the lectures. I'm going to talk about the crisis proper. What Toby ended saying when he talked about the summit at Riyadh, which was the catalyst or the starting point of this crisis. Well, of course, I'm a specialist in Iran, but it isn't just sheer chance that the Riyadh summit was one day after the May elections in Iran, and it's not sheer chance either that everything exploded after the outcome of the elections in Iran wasn't quite what they expected, and that's why they designated Iran. And because before that, they always said they were the greatest destabilizer in the area and backer of terrorism. But Rouhani won the elections, and it had a foreign policy that nobody envisages will change in the coming 4 years, bearing in mind that the greatest success of his mandate has been the signing of the nuclear deal, which bothered the Gulf countries a lot, but put Iran in the world spotlight again and made it much more acceptable to Western countries and to the United States. But returning to what Toby Matthiesen was saying about Trump, if anybody is bothered to listen to it, Trump mentioned Iran 11 times in his speech, 10 very negatively, and 1 saying that the Iranians were great people. But the other 10 times it was negative. He didn't talk about any other country in the Gulf Cooperation Council. He doesn't talk about democracy, election, human rights, democratization, nothing. He didn't mention that. In the context in which Iran was being pointed to as a major destabilizer in the area, and the speech was like a green light by Trump to the Gulf Cooperation countries, to the Arab countries, to Muslim countries in general, that they could do what they wanted, that he wasn't going to condition their policies, that they could fight against what they considered to be a destabilizer in the area. But what they consider to be destabilizing factors or countries. Well, what is a destabilizer, and from what standpoint? One is from an international relations standpoint, or bilateral relations, and another is from a domestic standpoint. Here we need to look at the domestic standpoint. Anything that is seen as in danger to the stability of the governing families, the governments of the governing families, the status quo, is considered to be a threat that must be fought at any cost, with any confrontation that may be necessary. So it's not by chance that this happened on 21st of May, a crisis that started just a few days later with something that isn't yet clear, but that we cannot forget, that the Qatar news agency was allegedly hacked, and 3 comments, very brief comments by an alleged speech by Sheikh at the Qatar military school. Everyone I know and I've talked to said that the head of state never gives a speech at that graduation ceremony at that military school, so it's impossible that he has. And what they're saying is so this Q&A hacking was related to one comment on Iran, another on Israel, and another on Trump or the United States, or the United States. If we look at how this crisis started, if we see all the changes have taken place in the list of claims by Saudi Arabia and all the comings and goings of what Qatar is doing, why is Qatar is now under attack? Well, my first interpretation is that first they shot, and then they decided how to fill in the reasons for firing against Qatar. This isn't a defense of Qatar. I just want to know why they did it. So one of the first measures they taken in this decision by Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Egypt was to block Qatar and Al Jazeera and any other medium were blocked. Therefore, Qatar was not given the opportunity to give its own vision, standpoint, explanation to the countries that were blocking them, which also sets, well, as Toby was saying, Al Jazeera has always been very problematic, not just for the Saudis, but for all the regimes in the area. They've always been a bother to everyone, and they said, okay, let's put them in the same bag and we can get Al Jazeera to close down too. But if you look at Al Jazeera, if you have seen how it's developed over the years, you see its power, its mobilization capacity, how its attraction of the public. It's very difficult to reach the conclusion that they foster terrorism, for instance, or that they're a school for jihadists, beyond agreeing or not with their agenda, beyond their being official representatives of the regime or not, but they are perhaps considered to be the most open news media in the entire region. Therefore, to put Al Jazeera in the same package made no sense whatsoever. What was surprising in Qatar, what surprised many of us, was how high they started. There was no escalation. They went straight for the top. They blocked the borders, the media. They took measures regarding Qatari citizens and citizens belonging to the 4 blocking countries without considering the consequences, be they financial, human, work-related, migration, from the very start, the measures aimed for the top. They didn't take into account there were many mixed marriages. Qataris, Emiratis, Saudis with people from Bahrain, and so on. There are almost 200,000 Egyptians working in Qatar, for instance. And the first measure taken was to ask the citizens of these four countries to return to their countries. And that was a terrible migration problem because Qatar was also isolated by air traffic. Air traffic had been cut off. Colleagues of ours who are Emiratis or from Bahrain, they waited out until the very last minute to see what's going to happen because their work situation was also in danger. And here, perhaps, there's a difference with how Qatar would treat the other Gulf countries' citizens, Egyptians and so on. Regarding Gulf citizens, there was no imposition or limitation for them to return to their countries and come back to Qatar as soon as the situation allowed it safely. With Egypt, that wasn't that clear. So many Egyptians who had even planned to go to Egypt for their holidays didn't, because they were afraid of not being able to go back to Qatar. So the human component wasn't taken into account. It had to be revised later, and for humanitarian reasons, there were some exceptions made to avoid producing problems in mixed families and so on. But when all this started, and this is where the role of the United States comes into play. The first thing Trump did is point to Qatar directly. He said, if all the fingers are pointing at Qatar, Qatar it might even be responsible for terrorism. When I saw that, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I thought that things were getting out of control, and I think if Trump's previous speech gave them the green light, this was the speech that made it clear to Saudi Arabia that the United States were not going to be limiting them in any way. Fortunately, things have not continued this way, and the White House has now shown a more logical initiative to try to appease the situation. But these tweets by Trump opened up the field for all kinds of accusations against Qatar. Any accusation was considered to be valid. There was a list of 11 demands. Iran demanded from Qatar to demanded it to cut off its relations with Iran. They had an important Turkish base in Qatar that they had to close down Al Jazeera, stop financing terrorist groups, among which Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, and groups such as the movement of February 14th of Bahrain as a result of the Arab Spring. And when you read that list, you seem to understand that, okay, let's the four of us get together and see what we can accuse them of, and we can put it all in that bag and make a package of it. The package was very difficult for them to sell. Closing down a Turkish airbase, shutting down Al Jazeera, had nothing to do with what they were purportedly defending. They were directly attacking the sovereignty of the country without apparent reasons. From there on, we witnessed the change. I was going to say change, but it's not exactly a change. But the Department of State started to change its position. They needed to show that the United States did not want to promote an escalation in the area, and that it was taking into account that it was about to close an important arms deal with Qatar, and it didn't make sense for it to have its greatest base in Qatar, the greatest in the area, and an arms deal with a country whose president they were pointing at as a terrorist harboring country. But the first attempts, therefore, did not produce many results. But they did reach a point where the four countries of the blockade shortlisted 6 principles, the other demands having been dropped, and focusing more on terrorism. Bearing in mind that requesting things that were practically impossible, unacceptable to any country around the world because they attack that country's sovereignty directly. What these 4 countries have done is focus on something that obviously at world level is very well perceived: counterterrorism and fighting the source of terrorist financing. Nobody's going to say those reasons are unacceptable, are they? So, in the meantime, we have Rex Tillerson, visiting the countries in the region yesterday in Saudi Arabia, tomorrow in Qatar, and he signed an agreement to fight terrorism. I forgot to mention the summit in Cairo last Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken, where Qatar sent its list or its response, its answer, negative answers to the claims made by the other 4 countries. So the situation is at a standstill, as it was since almost the very start. So with Rex Tillerson's visit and the signing of this agreement against the financing of terrorism, I think an opportunity has been lost, an almost unique opportunity. For the first time, there was something that Qatar was doing directly with the United States as a counterpart, and it could have been an element to be considered a first step towards the demands of these 4 states. But these 4 states said, oh no, this is not enough. They haven't even admitted that there could be a first step towards unblocking the crisis. So we're almost in the same situation as before. So neither Qatar has accepted that any of the demands, claims, the requirements of these 4 blocking countries, nor have these countries changed their intentions regarding their demands in one bit. So now we're at a dead stop, and we don't know where things can head for. So what has the impact of this crisis been on Qatar and the region? Until just a few weeks ago, I was in Qatar, and the talks, I still continue talking to my colleagues here. They say, well, this has become normalized already. From the very start, there were 1-2 days panic, but it wasn't even a panic, they say. Of people went to buy, well, a milk at the supermarkets because it was, of course, it was finished, but that's because everybody hoarded it. But immediately, fruit and vegetables came in from Turkey, from Iran. People did not try to escape en masse. The airport was normal, and things became very normal. People have now left on vacation already, and there is no problem with food, no food shortages, or logistic problems. Maybe things that are strategically important, such as the construction sector, have not suffered that much from the consequences. And Saudi companies that supplied cement and other construction materials to Qatar, what they do is quickly look for an intermediary in Oman. So what they do is sell to Oman, resell to Oman. Of course, this means costs go up and delivery times are longer. But no project has been stopped because of this blockade, at least until this a week ago, when I could talk to people in Qatar. Everyone must have seen the images, the pictures on the 400 Australian cows flying Qatar Airways, business class, I think it was, which obviously did not happen then Qatar is a country that does not produce foodstuff, so they have a plan to develop food and fruit and vegetables, everything. They have to fly everything in, even water, but this is a plan that Qatar has been developing to guarantee food security. And what they did is just hurry it up. Instead of bringing them by sea, they flew in the cows and they took them to the farms that were already waiting for them. So Qatar was more or less ready. Many of the plans implemented now to supplement the problems were already half planned, if not planned, because Qatar had to guarantee their food security, and maybe later during the Q&A we can go through this, but this told Qatar that they could not trust the Saudis' friendship 100%. This has already been demanded from Qatar to avoid intervening in the matters of other countries, in the affairs of other countries, to sign the counter-terrorist agreements, in the internal security agreements of the Council, the Gulf Council, but Kuwait hadn't signed it either, and nothing happened. And then the Saudi, the Emirati, expeditionary Arabiya, and other Emirati channels were very threatening. They already threatened Qatar with precisely what they're doing now. So they were threatening them with closing them down, and by air, land, and sea, and that's precisely what they did. So that was enough for Qatar to prepare for such a situation. And today, therefore, the problems aren't that big. Of course, everything is more expensive now. It's not the same to bring milk from Saudi Arabia by truck than to bring it from Turkey by air. But we are talking about Qatar and other countries such as Saudi Arabia, who have a lot of money, a big fat checkbook, and they can hold out this crisis. Both Qataris, Emiratis, and the Saudis can hold this out, because they have an impressive amount of money. The Emirates and the Saudis are also economically affected by it, but they have the greatest sovereign funds and reserves in the world. And although very many people have taken money out of their Qatari accounts, many foreign workers who have gone away on holidays took their money with them, but this has not affected the reserves of the Qatari Central Bank. As I was saying earlier, the key element in understanding this crisis and its impact continues to be about the survival of the political regimes, the governing houses, anything that is considered to be a threat and that is not accepted by the others turns this other country into a pariah. So, but they have increased their sources of threat. The Arab Spring has not affected everyone the same, but they've shown that no one is immune, and a spark can make a fire. And all the Gulf countries have taken this very seriously, including Qatar. But Saudi Arabia is the one that tried to impose its criteria of what is and isn't dangerous to the other Gulf countries. Saudi Arabia considers Iran to be the most dangerous, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Shia, and they need to be accepted, if they say so, by the remaining countries in the region. Not all do. Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar have different viewpoints on what Iran means to the region, on what the Shia mean in their own countries, what the Muslim Brotherhood means, and the Islamists. Members of the Muslim Brotherhood have been parliamentarians in Bahrain. They're also parliamentarians in Kuwait. The relationship between Oman and Kuwait with Iran are even better than those of Qatar, and even of the Emirati relations with Iran are wonderful commercially with Iran. But that does not seem to be bothering the Saudis. So, this is not understandable, even though, yes, of course, Iran is a key element in this dispute, and they have the fingers have been pointed at them directly. But the Iranian element is not that important in this crisis in particular. We're talking about survival, authority in their own countries, and that the succession of Mohammed bin Salman has been decided in the midst of the crisis. Let's not forget that. So let's not forget that they need to guarantee the succession, the survival of the regime, and everyone needs to accept that within and outside Saudi Arabia. So that's the context in a war in which Saudi Arabia is not looking very good. In a Syrian context in which, as Toby mentioned, it's not clear what the final outcome will be, and that the Saudi position isn't the most beneficial position. Saudi Arabia is losing a certain degree of authority in the region, and losing authority as a state, they, as leaders, as rulers, are losing face and authority as well. And they need to have a coup of effect to show who is in charge, who is the boss. If they're starting to question us abroad, they will start doing so in our country as well. And that person will reach the government perhaps when he's 40 years of age, and that had never ever happened in Saudi Arabia, if I'm not mistaken. If you do give me some time, I do want to mention two very short things on the role of Iran. It was mentioned that they were the main beneficiaries in this situation. They've done nothing. They've just benefited from the chaos generated without having to do anything. They just carry on with their own foreign policy without doing anything to bother anyone or anything specific. The role of Turkey, I consider it to be, and we can talk about this during question time, but couldn't be happier, Turkey, because despite Qatar being very happy with their Turkey's explicit support and sending weapons to the base that had already been decided, an agreement that had already been reached beforehand. But in this context, sending troops is a message that is very belligerent, and they could have avoided that in order to reduce the tension, instead of saying, well, if they attack me, I can defend myself, and because I have soldiers. That does not contribute to helping to solve the situation. Then the role of the United States. We must differentiate the role as an institution and a state, and then the base in Dubai. It's a mixed base. It's not only American. It's paid by Qatar, and it's in Qatar. It's paid half and half by them, and the United States has not considered removing it. It would be financial suicide. But the historical and institutional role of the United States cannot be confused with Trump's role, which is quite sad, to use that expression. And then the Gulf Cooperation Council, what is it? Is there a future for it? Does it truly exist? We can talk about it during question time if you're interested, and if Toby considers it to be, if he thinks there can be a future to this in the short term.
And your question about the future of the GCC, it's not really my decision to make. But even if it can be saved as an institution later on, I mean, I don't think it has the prospect of going through a closer union, which is what was the debate in the last few years. More likely is what we're seeing now, which is basically Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi / the UAE, and Bahrain as a kind of, follow-on, getting much closer together on many domestic and regional issues, and in alliance with some of their, allies in the region, in this case, Egypt. But Yemen, that was a very good question. We should have talked about Yemen more. But if you only take Yemen as an example, yes, technically the GCC states except Oman are there together. Even Qatar was involved in that war on their side. But they have quite different visions, nevertheless, of what should happen there. If they have, visions at all, that was another good point. Sometimes, things just happen, rushed decisions are made, and then you're left analyzing this for a long time. But in Yemen, in fact, in Yemen was one of the cases where Saudi Arabia was aligned with the local branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Islah, which was close to Qatar, and where basically, they fought together in the war. They were to a large extent, the local fighters in the war against the Houthis, and have now been decimated in some areas. So Yemen is so complicated that it really doesn't fit very well into any of these things. But the UAE, for example, has a different idea of what should happen with Yemeni unification, or should Yemen be separate again, South Yemen independent, perhaps. There are many very big questions that will still need to be resolved, and may lead to tensions between those states. On loads of the regional issues, because if you've ever been to Saudi Arabia and you've ever been to Dubai, you realize they're actually not really the same kind of places, but who knows, maybe they will be. But there are strong, structural differences in terms of what the role of religion and views of regional politics. And now they've agreed on certain issues and are pushing those. In some cases that has a pretty troubling effect, and Yemen is one such case where the situation is stuck. Nobody knows how to get out of it, and I'm afraid that perhaps this new situation with Qatar will go a similar direction. Obviously, this has much less human toll, right? We shouldn't forget Yemen is one, or perhaps the biggest humanitarian crisis on the planet at the moment. It's quite different proportions from a few milk running out for 2 days in the wealthiest country on earth. So, but the decisions and where they are made, and this idea of either you're with us or you're not with us, and if you're not with us, we'll do basically anything to punish you. That's an attitude that has, proven problematic in the region now.
Yo lo siento mucho, pero creo que
I unfortunately think that those of us here, although we do understand that it's very difficult, we would appreciate a comment on how this may evolve, what could happen, being aware of how difficult it is to answer that question, but we dare to insist, if we may. What are the stakes? Shall we bet on it? The other day, here, at another meeting with Karim and other people, is that I'm not optimistic about it. And as of 15 days ago or so, I'm even less optimistic than before. I can see that both positions are very entrenched. Qatar says no, 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 and no to everything and anything the other four countries are demanding from them. Haven't said anything regarding sponsorship of terrorism, and they do not consider that they have to do anything regarding the Turkish base, Iran, or Al Jazeera. And they feel that they're legitimated to do so. They feel support for it, and they feel financially backed by the Qatari population, even expats who live in Qatar. So they don't see why they have to change anything they're doing. On the other hand, the four countries that constitute the blockade consider that Qatar has not given any positive answers and that all they can do is increase the pressure. And how are they going to do that? Obviously, the war, I think, is out of the question. I do not think there's going to be a war. Obviously, I wouldn't be able to go back to Qatar either, would I? But there will be more diplomatic pressure, more lobbying in other spheres. King Salman having gone to the African summit, although he says it has nothing to do with it, it obviously does, and that we're beginning to see trips and meetings with European states and leaders will become something we will see more because they will try to exert diplomatic pressure with third parties to cut ties with Qatar. I think that will be the step. I don't think there's going to be a de-escalation. Unfortunately, I think it will escalate a little yet, but I don't foresee a war.
The future, and I'm not planning to do now. All I know is that this is hurting all the states involved, perhaps except Egypt. But all the Gulf states, it hurts because, well, they were around the world seen as more or less, one thing. I mean, as the Australians, they fly through there to the rest of the world. Now they didn't really know the difference between this state and that state. They just, there was the Gulf, there's this economic model, and so on, and had a certain success. Now they're suddenly, at loggerheads with each other for reasons difficult to understand for a lot of people. So it is costly for everyone involved, that I know, and a lot of people are making money out of it. I mean, lobbyists, newspapers, advertising agencies. Half of London is covered in Qatar Airways ads every day in all the big newspapers, Qatar Airways. And on the other hand, too. So I just think it's counterproductive for the states involved, but that doesn't mean that it will end soon, unfortunately. Is that an okay answer?
Taking into account what Toby also mentioned, nobody's dying here. It's a crisis that, while the money is flowing, can be protracted until one of the two sides say, oops, my checkbook is almost finished. It's not that the world is calling for this to be solved. Well, if the Gulf countries are fighting, well, too bad for them. It's their problem because they're the ones that are harmed by it. But I do think this is going to continue. Thank you all very much for coming. I hope you have found it to be fruitful. I hope you can take a few ideas with you, more information, more knowledge, and we hope to see you soon at Casa Árabe.